Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep.
The voyages of the Vikings to the New World. The sea was a slow, breathing thing that night, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Above it, the sky curved vast and dark, its stars pricked into existence like tiny fires along the roof of the world. A longship rode those gentle swells, its dragon-headed prow cutting a quiet path through the moonlit water. The oars were drawn in, the sail slack, and the men aboard lay in cloaks and furs, drifting in a shallow, watchful sleep. Only one figure remained fully awake. Leif stood near the prow, one hand resting on the carved dragon's neck, his other hand wrapped around the leather strap of his cloak as the wind nudged at him. The air smelled of salt and old ice, like the breath of the northern seas he had known since childhood. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the curve of the ocean, lay Greenland, with its sharp cliffs and scattered settlements pressed up against the edge of the world they believed they knew. Ahead, there was only darkness and the whisper of something more. He listened to the water stroking the hull, the faint creak of wood, the soft exhale of sleeping men. It felt to him as though the ship moved not just across the ocean, but across time and memory, gliding toward a story that had been waiting centuries to be told his father's tales. The rumors told in Icelandic halls, the whispered accounts of a strange shoreline found by accident. All of them drifted through his mind like low clouds. They said there was land out here, land beyond Greenland, beyond the shifting floes and cold fogs, land with forests so thick you could walk among trees for days, land with rivers that ran clear and deep, land where grapes grew wild, where game was plentiful, where the air itself seemed gentler. Some had laughed at the idea, others had shrugged and let it pass like any other tale told next to a fire. But the story had grown roots in Leif's mind and taken hold. Now, as the ship glided under the stars, he felt that story pulling him forward. A soft footstep sounded behind him. "You do not sleep," came a low voice. Leif turned slightly. It was Tyrkir, the older man who had travelled with his family for so long. He was as much kin as any blood relative. His hair was threaded with grey, his beard thick, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Someone should watch the sea," Leif murmured. "The sea will still be here in the morning," Tyrkir replied gently. "It always is." Leif's gaze slipped back to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the faint line where sea met sky. "Do you remember," he asked quietly, "what my father said about the land to the west?" Tyrkir stepped up beside him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "I remember many things your father said. Some of them were wise, some were spoken after too much mead." A faint smile touched his lips. "But yes, I remember. A coast glimpsed in bad weather. A ship blown off course strange woods. No settlements, only the promise of what might be." Leif nodded slowly. "It feels close, as if we have been drifting toward it our whole lives without knowing." "Stories have a way of doing that," Tyrkir said. "They lie in wait until someone is willing to sail far enough to meet them." The wind shifted, stroking the sail. Somewhere in the darkness, a wave rose a little higher than the others, and then slumped beneath the hull with a soft, hollow sound. The motion swayed the men sleeping along the benches, but they did not wake. The night seemed to fold around the ship like a cloak, isolating it in a small moving circle of creaks and whispers. "Sleep, Leaf," Tirkir said at last. "Morning will come whether you watch for it or not, and you will need clear eyes when it does." Leaf hesitated, then nodded. He gave the dragon's head a final, absent pat, as if to reassure the ship itself, and made his way back toward the center of the longship. He lay down among his men, the boards cool beneath him, his cloak scratching lightly against his cheek. The motion of the sea cradled him, slow and patient. His thoughts drifted backward, to Greenland, to Iceland, to the tales of the old country across the ocean, but always, like a needle returning to north, his mind turned toward that unnamed shore ahead. He imagined it dimly, a line of land appearing out of morning mist, and as the rocking lulled him at last toward sleep, he felt as though that distant coastline was already watching them approach. Morning stole into the sky gradually, the stars fading one by one, as if some unseen hand were gently snuffing them out. A pale band of light appeared in the east, spreading across the water until the sea shivered with brightness. The men stirred, rolling in their cloaks, blinking at the day. Oars were quietly shifted. A few muttered prayers. Someone coughed, the sound swallowed quickly by the open air. Leif rose, his muscles stiff, but his thoughts sharp. The wind had strengthened, and the sail now caught it, full and rounded, drawing the ship forward with renewed purpose. Foam hissed along the sides. Above, a few seabirds circled, white and grey against the lightning sky. He watched them, feeling his heart quicken. "We are still far from known waters," one of the men murmured, stepping to stand beside him. It was Bjarni, broad-shouldered, with sunburned cheeks and a steady gaze. "Yet there are birds." "Birds mean land," Leif replied quietly. "Somewhere ahead, somewhere near. They do not drift so far from shore for nothing." They sailed on. The hours of the day seemed to stretch and thin, like threads pulled slowly from a loom. The men rowed in turns when the wind slackened, their oars dipping in and out of the water with the slow, unhurried rhythm of practiced work. When the breeze returned, they rested, letting the ship glide. They ate simply, dried fish, bread hard as wood, water carefully portioned, and spoke little. The ocean had a way of taking speech and folding it back into itself until silence felt more natural. But in each quiet glance toward the horizon, there was an unspoken question. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the world shifted. A darker line appeared along the edge of the water, so faint at first it was easy to mistake it for a trick of light, or a cloud bank hanging low. Yet as the longship moved steadily forward, that line did not dissolve. Instead, it grew more distinct, separating itself from sea and sky. The closer they came, the more it took on shape, a low, rolling shadow that stretched across the distance. Leif's breath caught. Without meaning to, he placed a hand again on the dragon's head, as he had in the night, as if seeking balance. "Land," someone whispered. The words spread softly along the length of the ship. Men rose from their benches, squinting against the light, craning their necks. Tirkir moved forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the distant shoreline. "This is no ice," he said after a moment. "No floating bergs, no broken fields of white. This is Earth. The ship pressed on. The air began to change as the day dipped lower, carrying scents that were not of the open sea. There was a hint of moss, of soil warmed beneath unseen trees, of something green and quiet. The men fell even more silent, each feeling in his own way the strange intimacy of approaching a land no one among them had ever known. Closer still, and they could see that the coastline was not sheer and forbidding, but gathered into soft rises and dips. Low hills met the water, with darker bands of what could only be forest beyond. The sky above that distant land seemed somehow gentler, its colours washed with a faint, hazy gold. Leif felt a slow, deep calm settle over him. Fear, excitement, wonder, all of it blended into something steady. This was what he had come for, what the ship itself seemed made for, to slip across the unknown and press its prow against a shore that had, until now, existed only in half-remembered stories and scattered rumours. "Bring us in slowly," he said. "We'll look for a bay, a quiet place to land." The men bent to their work with a muted, reverent readiness. The longship angled nearer the shoreline, its sails shifting, oars dipping lightly to guide it. The water shallowed gradually, turning from deep indigo to softer hues, greenish and lit from beneath where the sun's light reached toward the unseen bottom. In the distance, a small cove opened in the coastline, a sheltered curve where the land embraced the sea in a gentle arc. The approach was clear of rocks. The water, calm grasses trailed along the edge, and beyond them, a scatter of low shrubs and the first hints of taller trees, their leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. "That will do," Leif murmured. They glided into the cove as evening colours thickened in the sky. The oars pulled back. The men prepared the anchor stone, letting it slide down with a soft, muffled splash. The longship settled into stillness, the faint rocking of the water, now a reassuring cradle rather than a ceaseless journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They listened to the soft lap of waves against the hull, to the distant rustle of leaves on unknown trees, to the calls of birds they did not recognize. The land, so close now, seemed to breathe quietly, an immense presence that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. Leif drew in a slow breath of air that tasted of soil and growth, different from the sharp salt tang he had known for weeks. "We will go ashore," he said gently. "Not in a rush. Step by step. The sea has carried us far. Let us meet this place with respect." They lowered a small boat and drifted toward the narrow strip of shore. The water around them was glassy, reflecting the subtle colours of the sky. As the keel brushed the sand, a quiet shiver passed through the men, as if they were crossing a boundary, not just of distance, but of time itself. Leif stepped out first. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cool sand. The sensation was strangely profound, as if the earth itself were acknowledging him. He walked a little farther up the beach, until the sand gave way to firmer ground, then stopped and simply stood there. Behind him, the others followed, their footfalls soft. They spread out slowly, touching the low shrubs, bending to feel the texture of unfamiliar plants, lifting their faces to smell the air. No settlement greeted them, no smoke, no voices. Only the quiet murmur of the waves and the occasional call of a bird from the forest's edge. "This is it," Bjarni said quietly, his voice almost breath. We have stepped onto a land that no one in our world truly knows. Leif nodded. We will learn its shape, he replied. We will walk its forests, drink from its streams, and see what stories it holds, and we will carry those stories back, so others may know that the world is wider than they imagined. They moved inland a short distance, careful, unhurried. The ground rose gently, dotted with stones and small patches of grass. The trees beyond were tall and unfamiliar, their leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Shadows deepened among their trunks as the light faded, but it was not an unfriendly darkness. It felt alive, watchful, without being hostile. As they explored the edge of the woods, Tyrkir knelt beside a low vine that trailed across a small rise. Dark clusters of berries hung from it, heavy and ripe. He studied them intently, his face lit with an old, deep memory of other lands, other harvests. Leif, he called softly. Come see. Leif joined him, crouching beside the vine. Tyrkir plucked a berry, rolling it between his fingers. I have seen the like before, he murmured, back in the southern lands, beyond our northern seas. Grapes or something very like them. Grapes! The word hung in the air like a promise. This is a good place, Leif said at last. A gentle place. Perhaps it will be our Vinland, a land of wine and growth. They did not shout or cheer. The moment was too large for that. Instead, they shared a quiet, steady look, the kind that passes between people who realize they're standing at the opening of a door that will never close again. They returned to the ship at dusk, the sky now brushed with long strokes of purple and deep blue. Stars kindled once more, scattered across the firmament. The men settled in, their voices soft, their movements slowed by a deep, peaceful fatigue that came not just from travel, but from the weight of what they had found. Leif lay awake for a time, listening to the mingled sounds of land and sea. The waves lapped gently against the hull. Somewhere in the nearby forest, a night creature called, an unfamiliar voice in the darkness, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present. He felt the world expanding around him, like the sea had once expanded in his imagination when he first heard tales of distant shores. Now, those shores were under his feet. The map in his mind was no longer bounded by the edges of old stories. It pushed outward, making room for this new coastline, these new trees, these new stars overhead. As sleep finally drew him under, it seemed to him that the dragon-headed ship, resting quietly in the cove, was no longer perched at the edge of the world. Instead, it lay anchored in the middle of a much larger, deeper mystery, one that would carry ripples far into the future, long after their names were forgotten. The night passed, and with the dawn, the work of understanding the land began. They spent the next days exploring the coast, moving carefully along the shoreline, landing where small rivers met the sea, where sheltered inlets offered calm waters, where the forest opened into gentle meadows. They moved like guests who did not yet know the language of their host, watching, listening, learning the quiet patterns of wind and grass and water. They found streams cold and clear, their beds lined with smooth stones. They found stands of tall trees, some dark and needled, others broad-leafed and shifting with every breath of wind. They saw birds whose calls were strange to their ears, and animals slipping through the underbrush, quick shadows in the greenery. At each landing, they left the place as undisturbed as they could, taking only what they needed, marking little. They built small fires, careful with the embers, letting the smoke drift upward in faint grey tendrils. As they sat around those fires at night, the faces of the men flickered in the glow, their eyes reflecting both the light of the flames and the unspoken wonder of being so far from home in a land that had never known their kind. Sometimes, as the embers settled and the conversation faded, someone would speak up softly, telling of other voyages, of Iceland's cold shores, of Greenland's hard edges, of storms weathered and ice fields skirted. Those stories, once the farthest reach of their imagination, now felt like steps along a path that had led here. Leif listened to them all with quiet attention. The more they walked this new coastline, the more he felt that they were not just adding to their own saga, but stitching this land into the larger fabric of the world they knew it had waited, silent and patient, while their people had sailed and settled the north. Now, at last, the threads had crossed. On one of those evenings, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered overhead in a calm, untroubled sky, Leif lifted his gaze and let it wander across the constellations he had followed since childhood, the familiar shapes that guided sailors across the vastness. "They have always been there," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The stars, the lands, the currents, we have only just learned to see the paths between them." Tyrkir, seated nearby, nodded slowly. "And others may walk those paths after us," he replied. "In time, this land will not be a whisper, but a place with a name spoken in many halls." Leif thought of that, of ships like theirs, of families, of settlements, of fires lit along this distant shore, voices rising in languages that had never touched this air before. The idea felt both distant and very close, like a shadow cast by a fire yet to be lit. For now, though, the land remained mostly untouched, their presence a small ripple in a vast, quiet sea of time. They would not stay long. Their purpose was to see, to know, to remember, and then to return. Yet even as they made their preparations, gathering small sample of wood and grapes and other signs of the richness they had found, a soft certainty settled in Leif's heart. This was not the end of the story. This was only the first line, spoken into the hush of a sleeping world. He felt it in the way the wind curled around the sail, in the way the waves welcomed the keel, in the way the forest watched them with a patience that suggested it expected more visitors in ages to come. When at last they turned the prow of the ship away from the shore and let the wind catch the sail for the journey back toward Greenland, Leif did not feel that they were leaving the land behind. Instead, it felt as though the memory of it had already travelled ahead of them, carried in the shape of the waves, in the flight of birds, in the changing light on the water. The longship moved smoothly across the sea, and the coastline slowly diminished, a dark line, then a smudge, then only an idea. But in the minds of those aboard, it remained vivid. The taste of the air, the softness of the sand beneath their boots, the rustle of leaves and trees that had never known the sound of their speech before. As night fell and the stars reappeared, steady and unchanging, Leif lay awake once more beneath the sky. The same constellations that had accompanied them west now stretched overhead, guiding them eastward toward home. Yet home itself had shifted, its boundaries stretched by what they had seen. He closed his eyes and saw again the curve of that sheltered cove, the ripples along its surface, the way the forest waded just beyond the line of shore. The voyages, he realized, were not just paths cut through the sea. They were threads binding places together, making the world feel at once larger and more connected. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, he felt himself drifting gently towards sleep as the ship rocked and the waves whispered their long, slow lullaby. Years later, long after the first journey, when the memory of that gentle coastline settled into the hearts of many, other ships would follow. The ocean did not change its nature for them. It remained the same vast, restless being, breathing wind and wave, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. Yet the men who set out upon it were different. They carried with them the knowledge that the sea did not simply fall away into nothingness beyond Greenland. They knew there was land in that wide westward silence, land with forests and flowing waters, land where grapes and game and timber might be found. And so the voyages continued. One ship, smaller than Leif's, but sturdy and well made, set out from Greenland under a sky streaked with pale clouds. Among its crew were men and women who had heard the stories of Vinland as children, their imaginations shaped by the tales of their elders. Now, they wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. The leader of this voyage, Karlsefni, stood at the helm with a quiet determination. He had listened to life's accounts by the longhouse fire, had seen the wood and grapes and other tokens brought back from that distant shore. To him, Finland was not just a curiosity, it was a possibility, a place where families might settle, where farms might take root, where winter might be kinder than in the cold, hard lands of the north. As the ship rocked gently on the swells, his gaze travelled over the faces of those aboard. There were strong-armed sailors used to hauling nets and rowing through sleet. There were women cradling children, their eyes bright with both worry and hope. There were older men, grey in hair, but still sharp of mind, who had seen many coasts and now wished to see one more. Crossing was not simple. There were days when fog wrapped itself around the ship so tightly that the world shrank to the sound of water against the hull and the feel of damp air on their skin. There were nights when the wind rose and the waves lifted them high, then dropped them deep into cold hollows, the ship's timbers groaning softly with the strain. Yet they held to their course, guided by the stars and currents, and by the quiet belief that beyond the arc of the sea, that remembered shore still waited. When, at last, the birds appeared and the scent of unseen earth drifted over the water, a murmur passed along the ship. People straightened, eyes turned eagerly toward the horizon. As before, the first sight of land came like a slow revelation, a dark line, a soft shape, a coastline emerging from haze. Karlsefni stood silent as they approached, his heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For him, this was more than the fulfillment of a story. It was the opening of a new chapter in the lives of those who had left behind their homes for the unknown. They found, not far from where Leif's ship had once anchored, a place that seemed well suited to their hopes. A gentle river flowed into the sea, its mouth widening into a sheltered bay. Meadows spread along its banks, and beyond them, forested hills rose in quiet layers. They landed cautiously, as Leif's crew had done years before, stepping onto the sand with a mixture of reverence and careful curiosity. But this time, There was more activity, more movement. They unloaded goods, tools, livestock. They walked the ground not just as visitors, but as people looking for the best places to build shelters, to plant crops, to tether animals. The land received them with the same quiet patience it had shown the first explorers. The river ran on, untroubled, its surface reflecting the sky. Birds flitted through the trees, indifferent to the newcomers. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. They built their first dwellings near the river's edge, simple structures of timber and turf, low but sturdy, their roofs blending into the land itself. Smoke soon began to curl upward from their hearts, thin grey lines against the sky. Children's voices, unsure at first, then more confident, mixed with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. At night, the people of this small settlement gathered around their fires, the glow casting gentle halos around their faces. They spoke of home, of Greenland's harsh winters, of Iceland's volcanic shores, of the old stories from Norway and beyond. Yet more and more, their words turned to this place, the feel of the soil beneath their hands, the taste of its water, the paths through its forests. They gave names to the river, to the bay, to the nearby hills, stitching their own language into the fabric of the land. Those names, carried on the wind and spoken over meals, warmed the place with a quiet familiarity. Yet they knew they were not alone in this wide world. In time, they saw signs that others lived here too. Not their kind, but people whose presence was written in the remains of fires, in tracks along the riverbank, in tools left near berry bushes. The first encounters were distant, a glimpse of figures in the trees, a canoe moving quietly along the far shore of the river, the echo of voices carried by the wind. Karlsefni, standing at the edge of the forest one morning, saw 3 figures watching from across a meadow. They were still as stones, yet he could feel their alertness even at a distance. He lifted his hand, palm open, a gesture as old as greeting itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the figures lifted a hand as well, mirroring his motion. The moment passed like a breath. The figures melted back into the trees, gone as silently as they had appeared. Life in the settlement unfolded in rhythms shaped by the land. They fished in the river, the lines dipping into water that ran quiet and deep. They hunted game in the forest, moving with care, learning where the deer passed, where the wild animals drank at dusk. They gathered berries and other plants, guided sometimes by what they already knew, sometimes by cautious experimentation. Season followed season. The days grew longer, then shorter, then longer again. The settlers began to sense how the year turned in this new place, how the light shifted and the winds changed. Winter came, but it was softer than the winters of Greenland. Snow fell, but it did not seem as heavy. The river froze along its edges, but not entirely. The forest, even in its bareness, felt alive. Yet with all the gentleness of the land, there were difficulties. Crops did not always grow as expected. The unfamiliar plants sometimes concealed dangers hunting could be uncertain. And beneath everything lay an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the invisible lines between their world and that of the people who already lived here were delicate. Sometimes at night, Karlsefni lay awake, listening to the sounds beyond the walls of his hall, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleepers, the distant hoot of an owl. He thought of how far they were from the familiar coasts of home, how thin the line of their presence was here. It felt like a small flame burning in a vast darkness, beautiful, hopeful, but fragile. He did not speak of this often. Instead, he rose each morning and joined in the work, repairing structures, planning hunting trips, walking the paths near the settlement's edge, watching the tree line where the forest began. Over time, the encounters with the native people of the land grew more frequent. There were moments of quiet exchange, a shared fish, a traded tool, a hesitant smile. There were moments of tension, when a movement was misunderstood or a boundary crossed unknowingly. People of the settlement began to understand that they were not simply writing their own story here. They had entered into a story already in progress, one with its own deep roots and countless voices. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the river's surface turned to silver, Karlsefni stood with a small group near the edge of the settlement. A canoe approached along the river, paddled by two figures. They came slowly, without haste, their motions smooth and calm. When they drew near the shore, they paused, measuring the distance, measuring the faces watching them. Karlsefni stepped forward, leaving his weapons behind. He held out a small object, a piece of cloth dyed with a bright, rich color. The canoe's nearer paddler studied it for a moment, then reached into a woven bag and brought out a carved object, a small figure of wood shaped with care. They traded, hands crossing briefly over the water between canoe and shore. No words were shared that either side could understand. Yet in that exchange, something quiet passed between them, a recognition that, for all the distance and difference, they shared the same sky, the same river, the same night that would soon settle over the land. The voyages of the Vikings to this new world were not only journeys of distance, they were journeys of understanding, incomplete and fragile as all first meetings are. Those who came built their homes, but also carried with them the weight of their own history, their own ways of seeing the world. The land, already rich with the stories of those who had lived here for generations beyond counting, received them, but did not yield its entirety. In time, many of the settlers would leave. Some would find the uncertainties too great, tensions too wearing. Others would simply long for the familiar contours of their old homes. The sea, which had carried them here, would carry them back again. Their houses would stand for a while, then slowly dissolve into the earth, wood rotting, turf blending back into soil. Grass would grow where walls once stood. Trees would reclaim open spaces. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, indifferent to the brief presence of those who had paused along its banks. Yet the memory of these voyages would persist. In Greenland, in Iceland, in the far halls of Norway, tales would be told of Finland, the gentle land to the west where grapes grew and winters were kind. For some, the tales would be almost dreamlike, blurred at the edges, more myth than record. For others, they would be as real as the feel of salt spray on one's face. Parents would tell their children about the time their kin had crossed a vast unknown and touched a shore no one had known before. Around fires, in the dark of winter, voices would speak of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that carried sunlight along their surfaces, of birds whose cries were unlike any heard in the north. They would speak of canoes on quiet waters, of wary greetings, of the realization that the world was filled with many peoples, each with their own ways, their own understanding of the land. Generations would pass, the voyages would slip into the long river of memory, mingling with other tales of far journeys and harsh seas. Some would forget the exact details, names would fade, dates would blur, but the core of the story would remain, that once, long before many would believe or fully understand it, ships from the far north had sailed across the western sea and touched another continent. Far to the west, where the river flowed into the sea and the forest watched the shore, the land remembered in its own way. The old paths through the trees remained, traced by animals and people alike. The places where fires had once burned held a different quality to the soil, a subtle richness. A stone that had once been shaped by hands far from this place might lie half buried in the earth, moss creeping slowly over it, its meaning lost, yet its presence undeniable. Birds flew overhead, following their own inherited routes. Seasons turned. Children born in the villages of the land grew up with their own stories, some of which included mention of strangers in longboats, of brief visits, of small exchanges. For them, these were not tales of discovery, but of encounters, moments when different worlds brushed lightly against each other before moving apart again. The sea, indifferent to questions of who came first or who discovered whom, continued to rise and fall, its waves erasing and redrawing the shoreline in small, ceaseless ways. It remembered each ship that had crossed its surface only as a disturbance in its pattern, a momentary reordering of foam and current. Yet, in some sense, each voyage left an imprint, not in the water itself, but in the minds and hearts of those who sailed, and in the stories they carried home. Centuries later, when other ships from other lands would make similar crossings, guided by different maps and driven by different desires, the ocean would greet them with the same impartial motion, the land would receive them with the same quiet patience. New names would be given, new flags planted, new claims spoken. But beneath all of that, the older truth would remain. The world had always been wide, always filled with countless lives and stories, long before anyone people set sail to measure it with their own eyes. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World were a part of that truth. A series of journeys that, like soft waves, rolled gently from one shore to another, leaving behind traces that would sometimes be forgotten, sometimes rediscovered. Their longships, with their dragon heads and curved hulls, were instruments of curiosity as much as of bravery, carrying not just warriors, but farmers, traders, families, dreams. In the quiet of a long northern night, when the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the walls, it was easy to imagine those longships again, to see them drifting under a sky sprayed with stars, their sails catching the pale light of the moon. To picture men wrapped in cloaks against the chill, staring into the darkness ahead, and wondering what shape the morning would bring to the edge of the sea. A storyteller, seated by the hearth, might pause and let the silence stretch. The listeners, leaning closer, would feel the hush deepen, as if the room itself were waiting. Then, in a soft, steady voice, the storyteller would speak of Leif and his men, stealing through the night toward a coastline they had only half believed in, of the first step onto that damp, cool sand, of the grapes on the vine, heavy and ripe beneath an unfamiliar sky, of Karlsefni's settlement beside the river, of the smoke rising in thin spirals, of the quiet exchanges along the water's edge. The words would flow like the sea, calm and unhurried, carrying the listeners in their minds across the centuries and over the waves, until they could almost feel the rocking of the longship beneath them, hear the creak of the timbers, smell the mingled scents of salt and pine and distant earth. Outside, the wind would go on blowing and the snow would keep falling, but inside, by the fire, the world would gently widen, the edges of the map softening and flowing outward to make space for that distant shore. In that moment, the voyages would not be something lost in the past. They would be happening again, here, in the quiet space between words and breath. The longships would be gliding once more toward a waiting coastline. The stars would be shining above them, as they always had, as they always would. And as the story settled into its final, soft cadence, as the listeners' eyes grew heavy and their thoughts began to drift, the sense would remain that the world is vast and filled with hidden coasts, that beyond each known horizon, there may lie a shore waiting peacefully for the moment someone is brave enough, or curious enough, to seek it. The fire would sink into embers. The room would dim. Sleep would fold itself gently around the listeners, as the memory of waves and distant forests and starlit sails lingered lightly in their minds. Somewhere in that hazy space between waking and dreams, they would feel themselves carried across a wide, calm sea, toward a distant line of land where the river meets the ocean and the trees whisper softly in a language older than any map. And there, upon that quiet shore, the voyages of the Vikings to the New World would go on, not as battles or conquests, but as a slow, enduring echo, a reminder that the world has always been broader, more mysterious, and more beautifully connected than any single story can fully contain. The silent cathedrals of time, abandoned temples of forgotten faiths. By the time the world forgot the gods, their houses were already crumbling. Stone gives way slowly, more slowly than memory, so that the last worshipper may die centuries before the last column falls. Wind and rain go on whispering the names no one speaks, polishing the steps no one climbs. In that interval, between the fading of a faith and the collapse of its last sanctuary, something strange happens. Temples become cathedrals of time. I did not set out to find them. At least, that is what I said to myself the first night, when the airplane window showed a black ocean and a thin curve of moon, and the engine's hum merged with the ache behind my eyes. I told friends that I was doing research on comparative religion, on the archaeology of forgotten cults. It sounded polite, academic, respectable, but the truth is that I was tired of quick opinions and faster vanishing headlines, of gods that lasted 3 seasons of a streaming show and then were replaced. Tired of the way even the great religions, the living ones, were argued over like brands. Somewhere under that weariness was an impulse I could not quite name, a need to listen to something older than the noise. So I followed rumors, footnotes, and half-legible translations. I followed the way a strange name glows on a page, the way embers glow in ashes. I followed flights and buses and dirt roads, until one morning the sun hauled itself over a desert horizon, and I saw the first of the silent cathedrals. It rose from the plateau like a piece of dawn that had hardened into stone. From a distance the temple looked simple. 4 square walls and a flat roof, all of it carved from a pale glass-sheened rock that caught the light and scattered it. Up close, the simplicity dissolved into intricacy. Every surface was etched with lines so fine they were almost invisible. Rays, arcs, spirals, intersecting at strange angles. At first I thought of stars, then of something older than stars. My guide, a taciturn man in a sand-colored scarf, stopped the jeep a respectful distance from the ruins. "We go on foot," he said. "Road ends here." And he searched for a word in English. "Voices." "What kind of voices?" I asked. He lifted one shoulder. "Place remembers. Some people hear it, some do not." His eyes flicked to mine. "You're the kind who hears, I think." The air tasted of dust and light. Heat was already uncoiling off the ground. The wind was cool and carried a faint metallic tang, like old coins. As we walked, the temple shifted subtly with each step, its edges blurring, like something seen underwater. Mirages wobbled on the horizon, but this structure remained unnervingly clear, unnervingly present. Up close, I saw that the entrance was a low, narrow slit, no taller than my shoulders. Above it, carved into the stone lintel, was a symbol, a circle broken in 3 places, with a tiny inverted triangle at its heart. "You know the name of this place?" I asked my guide. "It has no name," he said. "Or rather, too many. The old stories." He waved a hand. "Sky Temple. House of the First Light. Shrine of the goddess who turned away." People tell stories when they see something they do not understand. "You don't believe any of them?" We thought about it. "I believe the stone. It is older than the stories. Stories follow stone, not the other way." Inside, the temperature dropped sharply. The light, instead of fading, seemed to thicken, turning the air into something like pale honey. The hall beyond the entrance was narrow and long, its walls converging toward a point of brightness at the far end. My footsteps sounded small and disrespectful. Thin grooves ran along the floor, so shallow they were almost smooth. Where they met the walls, the etchings there flared into cascades of lines that curved around each other in dedications to geometry I could not read. "It's like a sundial," I murmured, tracing one line with my fingertip. The stone felt unexpectedly warm, as if heat were running inside it like blood. But inside, underground. "Not a sundial," said a voice from the shadows ahead. "At least, not for this sun." I started so violently I almost fell. My guide merely inclined his head, as though he had been expecting this. A man stepped out from the bright haze at the end of the hall. He wore clothes that could have been taken from any era, a plain dark coat, trousers tucked into scuffed boots, a wide-brimmed hat whose shape refused to settle on a century. There was nothing remarkable about his face, except that, like his clothes, it would not stay still in my mind. Every time I looked away and back, I was sure he had been younger, or older, or differently shaped around the eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, heart still thudding. I was told no one lived out here." "No one does," he said. "I only keep watch." He extended a hand. "You can call me the keeper, if it helps." "Of what?" I asked automatically. "Of dust, of stories, of the places in between." His hand was warm and dry, his grip both firm and oddly weightless, as though he might drift away if I let go. "You've come to listen, haven't you?" I hesitated. "To learn, perhaps." "Learning is a species of listening," he said. "Come." We walked together down the narrowing hall. My guide stayed at the entrance, muttering something under his breath that might have been a prayer. The grooves in the floor deepened, and the lines on the walls grew denser, overlapping until they formed a shimmering lattice that hurt my eyes. There was a faith here once, the keeper said conversationally. They had no word for God, only for the one who was before. They believed the sky was a wound in the body of the universe, and that light was blood spilling through. That's vivid, I said. They were vivid people. They measured that blood with great care. He touched the wall with his fingertips, and for an instant the lines around his hand flared, like embers stirred by a breath. They carved the paths of suns you've never seen. They charted the turning of stars that were old when this planet was gas and fire. Time for them was not a river, but a cathedral. Rooms within rooms, all resonant at different frequencies. This place, his hand described a small arc taking in the hall, the temple, the blazing sky beyond, was their tuning fork. We reached the far end of the hall. Instead of a sanctum or altar, there was a circular chamber open to the sky. The roof had been cut away, or perhaps it had never existed. Walls rose in a smooth curve, their surfaces carved with spiraling grooves that all led upward, converging on the ragged circle of blue. In the center of the floor, a shallow basin of the same glass-like stone held a faint trace of darkness, like a shadow that had run out of substance. There were no statues, no offerings, no relics. They worshipped time? I asked. In a sense. The keeper tilted his head back, eyes half closed against the glare. They worshipped the before, the possibility that what came first still vibrates through what came after, that by listening just right, they could hear the first note. And did they? He smiled faintly. For a while. Every faith hears its God for a while. That is how faith survives its birth. But there are no temples in this world whose worshippers do not eventually stop listening. The miracle is not that faiths die. He touched the basin with the back of his knuckles. It is that their houses remain, long enough to remember for them. A gust of wind swept into the chamber, bringing with it the smell of far-off rain. For an instant, the basin darkened, and I thought I saw movement there. Not a reflection of the sky, but of something deeper. A skyscape in which the stars were arranged in unfamiliar constellations, an ink-blue firmament streaked with slow, luminous rivers. Then the wind passed, and the illusion with it. What happened to them? I asked. People who built this place? What happens to all such people? The keeper said softly. The sky changed, slowly, then all at once. The wound shifted. Blood fell differently. Their measurements ceased to match the world. They had poured themselves into this tuning fork, and the note it gave back no longer fit. Some tried to adjust. Some clung to the old patterns, insisting the sky was wrong, not they. Some walked out into the desert and followed the receding constellations until they died of thirst, still counting. And the temple? The stone stayed. Long after the last believer lay forgotten in the sand, the grooves remained. The walls continued to sing in the language of a sky that no longer existed. He opened his hands as if balancing invisible weights. No one listened, and yet time listened. It always does. That is when these places become what they are now, the silent cathedrals. Silent? I echoed. It doesn't feel silent. He glanced at me. You hear them then? What are they saying? That depends on who you are when you arrive, he said, and who you will be when you leave. We stood together in the strange, cool light, listening to something that was not exactly sound. It was like feeling the pulse in your wrist, a rhythm that had always been there, but which you notice only when you stop and pay attention. Images rose unbidden in my mind. Generations kneeling on this stone, eyes raised to a long-gone sky, hands tracing grooves into rock with patient tools, a child pressing her ear to the basin to hear the echo of stars. The feeling was not reverence so much as recognition. The people who had prayed here were gone, their God silent, their sky replaced. But the hunger that had built this temple, the hunger to locate themselves in something vast and enduring, felt familiar. After some unmeasured time, the keeper touched my elbow. "Come," he said, "there are other cathedrals. Time is patient, but your body is not. You will need food, water, sleep. You're coming with me?" I asked. "For a while, until we reach the next one." His smile was wry. "Besides, you may not find them without me. They do not appear on maps the way you think." On the drive back, my guide muttered about spirits and omens, and kindly but firmly refused my offer of extra payment if he would agree to take us to the second site. "This is as far as I go," he said, hand tightening on the steering wheel. "You want more old stones? Talk to your friend." My friend. I turned, but the keeper, who had sat in the jeep's shadow and spoken quietly with me moments before, was nowhere to be seen. Desert stretched unbroken on every side, shimmering with heat. "He left," my guide said with a shrug. "People like that, they come and go. You will see him again, if you're meant to." I almost protested that no one could have walked away into that open vastness without kicking up dust or leaving footprints. Instead, I closed my mouth, buckled my seatbelt, and watched the tempo recede in the rearview mirror. The sun climbed higher, turning the pale stone into a white flame against the sky. And then it was gone. For a time, my life seemed to resume its usual shape. There were hotel rooms and flights, emails and receipts, snippets of ordinary conversation. The memory of the desert temple faded at the edges, like a vivid dream. But I noticed myself pausing longer than necessary in museums, lingering in the rooms devoted to unknown cult, 3rd century BCE, or ritual object, culture undetermined. I found my eyes tracing the cracks in old statues, wondering what vibrations still lived in their stone. It was in a museum, in fact, that I saw the second cathedral. It was not the cathedral itself, of course, but lay many thousands of miles away, in a jungle I had never imagined visiting. It was a fragment, a borrowed piece, set behind glass with a neat label. Carved stone panel. Provenance: unknown river valley civilization, predating regional records. Symbolic imagery suggests ritual significance. The panel was no larger than a laptop screen, its edges worn and chipped. It showed a stylized archway surmounted by coiling vines, and beyond it a series of steps descending into waves. Above the arch, etched in delicate lines, was the same broken circle I had seen over the desert temple's door. Only here, the inverted triangle at its heart had been replaced with a tiny curling spiral. A small note at the bottom of the placard read, "Similar motifs found at submerged temple complex. Coordinates on file with research department." I stood there long enough that a security guard ambled over to ask if I was alright. "Fine," I said, but my voice sounded distant to my own ears. Could you tell me where these coordinates are? The submerged complex?" He gestured toward the help desk. "Ask there, but I doubt they'll give you that kind of information." They did not. The woman at the desk smiled apologetically and spoke of preservation, safety, the need for permits. I nodded and thanked her, and later that night, in the quiet of my hotel room, I searched for the fragment succession number in academic databases. There were papers, of course there were papers, discussing the river enclosure site, its puzzling isolation, its curious iconography. There were also, buried deeper, references to a certain independent consultant who sometimes appeared in field reports under titles like temporal site verification or non-standard chronology assessment. The name listed was not the keeper, of course, but the initials were the same. By that point, I was no longer pretending, even to myself, that I had stumbled into this. When you have heard a stone sing, you do not return easily to silence. The jungle was nothing like the desert, and yet they shared a certain density of time. In the desert, time lay exposed, flat and immense, unrumpled by foliage. In the jungle it grew in layers, leaf over leaf, vine over branch, fallen tree over stone. Every inch of ground seemed occupied by roots or rot or new growth, and the air hummed with insects and hidden birds. The boat that carried me upriver was a narrow wooden thing, its small engine coughing now and then in protest. The water was the color of old copper, opaque and slow-moving, carrying leaves, twigs, and the occasional startled fish. The local guide this time was a woman, older than my desert companion, her face cross-hatched with fine lines. She did not speak English, but she watched me with curious, amused eyes. We had been traveling for several hours when the river widened and the current slackened. The guide cut the engine and let the boat drift. Ahead, the water swirled around something that broke the surface, the corner of a stone block, slick with algae, its top just barely visible. "Altar," the guide said, tapping the stone with her paddle. Then she pointed beyond it, to where the river darkened. House below. A submerged temple lay entirely beneath the waterline, a drowned structure whose outlines could only be guessed at from the way the current moved. Here the river ran strangely cool, and when I trailed my fingers over the side, I felt not the solid resistance of expected depth, but an almost dizzying drop, as if the riverbed had fallen away into a chasm. I stared into the brown-green water, focusing past the reflections of clouds, until shapes began to emerge. Steps worn by countless feet descending into darkness, columns wrapped in trailing plants, carved reliefs of human figures, their faces eroded but their gestures intact, hands raised, not upward, but outward toward the river itself. "Goddess of the flood?" I guessed aloud. The guide shook her head, lips pulling back in something that was almost a smile and almost a grimace. "New goddess," she said slowly, searching for a word. "Door?" The river was a door. The temple was a hinge. The faithful had not come to appease some personified spirit of the water. They had come to slide open a passage between states. This much I could feel, and the way the hairs on my arms rose and the boat drifted over the submerged stairs. "You won't see much from here," said a voice at my shoulder. "The river is shy in the daytime." I did not start as violently as I had in the desert. Some part of me had been listening for that voice since I first saw the stone panel in the museum. "You're late," I said without turning. "Time is difficult to measure in places like this," the keeper replied. When I looked at him, he was sitting cross-legged in the stern of the boat, hat tipped back, bare feet trailing in the water. His coat was gone. He wore a short-sleeved shirt whose fabric clung damply to his arms. Beads of moisture glittered on his skin like tiny pearls. Besides, the river likes to decide these things. The guide did not appear to notice him. She sat at the bow, paddle resting across her knees, humming under her breath. "Is she?" I began. "She sees enough," the keeper said. "Not in the way you do, not in the way I do, but she has ferried archaeologists and pilgrims up this river for many years. She knows where it folds." Folds? He dipped his hand in the water, making small ripples. "Do you know how cloth bends when you gather it? Time does that too. Certain acts, repeated with enough belief, enough attention, can pinch the fabric of years. Shrines are often built at such pinches. Every prayer, every offering, tightens the fold, drawing different eras closer, until—" He snapped his fingers lightly. "You have a place where moments seep between centuries, very useful for those who wish to speak with their dead, or their gods, or their unborn descendants. And when no one comes anymore—" "Ah," he smiled. "And the fold does not simply straighten. It cannot. It is knotted now, like muscle grown around an old wound. The shrine falls silent, but the bend remains. Such places are resonant. Time eats its own tail there, in small, strange ways." We drifted over the submerged stairs again. This time, as I gazed down, the brown-green murk cleared for a heartbeat. I saw not just steps and shadows, but flickers of movement. People in garments woven from reeds, bearing clay jars. A procession of children scattering flower petals into the current. A woman with braided hair kneeling on the lowest step, arms spread as if to embrace the water. For an instant, her eyes rose to meet mine, and they held a grief so vast it cracked something in my chest. Then a leaf bumped against the side of the boat. The water clouded, and the vision dissolved. "Did you see that?" I whispered. "Yes," the keeper said quietly. "Who was she?" "Once, she was their doorkeeper. She knew the currents by taste, the moods of the river by the way it curved around her knees. When the tides of their history turned, she stood here and watched their world drown. There was nothing she could sacrifice that would have stopped it. The flood was not a god's wrath or a moral lesson. It was an upstream glacier melting, a tectonic plate shuddering. And yet, because she was keeper of the door, she felt responsible." "She still feels responsible," I said, my throat tight. "Time does not forgive as easily as you think," he said. "It does not punish either. It simply remembers, and in remembering, it holds certain gestures in place." The guide spoke then, in rapid phrases I could not follow, and pointed toward the shore. A tangle of roots and moss there concealed a narrow opening, a dark slit in the river bank. "Side door," the keeper said. "Come." The cave was damp, close, dripping with the slow patience of minerals. We walked single file, our flashlights picking out glistening stone formations and pale blind insects. The air smelled of earth, something else, a faint metallic tang, as if the river's blood had seeped into the rock. The passage widened abruptly into a cavern. whose ceiling was strung with stalactites like petrified fangs. The floor sloped gently down toward a still pool. Its surface was so smooth it might have been stone, but when I stepped closer, I saw my reflection shiver. Around the pool's rim, set into the rock, were carvings, the same archway motif I'd seen on the museum panel, repeated and varied. Some arches opened onto stylized waves, others onto curling clouds, others onto blankness. This, said the keeper, was their inner temple. Here they made their exchanges. Exchanges? Memories for omens, promises for postponements. You would call it prayer, they called it bargaining. I knelt at the edge of the pool. In its still depths, the reflection of the cave roof seemed impossibly far away, as if the water opened into a vertical shaft rather than a shallow basin. When I reached out, intending to test its depth, the keeper's hand closed gently around my wrist. Careful, he said. This place is not as abandoned as it looks. As if to confirm that, a drop of water fell from a stalactite and hit the pool with a soft plink. Rings spread outward, distorting my reflection. For an instant, I saw not my own face, but a rapid sequence of others. A man with ritual scars across his cheeks, a girl with hair braided in riverine patterns, an old woman whose eyes were filmed with cataracts, but whose gaze still burned. Are those the worshippers? I asked, shaking. In a way, the keeper released my wrist. Little echoes, trapped in the knot of time here. When you remember someone intensely, you bind them into your personal past. When enough people remember together, they carve a kind of channel through time. And those people are gone, but the place remains. The channel can fill with reflections. Ghosts, I said, if you like, but not in the sense of spirits with unfinished business. Think of them as habits of memory the world itself has developed. These are places where time remembers how it was used. I thought of the river temple, visible only as broken outlines beneath the surface, of the woman on the steps, whose grief still vibrated in my bones. Why show me this? I whispered. Why are you bringing me to these cathedrals? The keeper crouched beside me. The pool's dim light picked out small lines around his eyes that I did not recall seeing before. Because you are listening, he said. Because you're tired of noise and hungry for the deeper hum beneath it. Because there is a danger in forgetting that everything you think is permanent will one day be a drowned stare or a desert groove, and yet the imprint of your gestures will endure. Because some stories are only complete when someone agrees to carry them forward, not as dogma, but as understanding. He dipped 2 fingers into the water. For a moment, the pool darkened, and in its depths I saw, not the past, but something that might have been the future. The same river, narrower, its banks choked with plastic and rusting metal, skyscrapers rising in the hazy distance, a small child peering into a muddy puddle between broken concrete slabs, her expression filled with the same aching curiosity I had felt in the desert temple. Then the vision passed. This is the second cathedral, the keeper said softly. There will be others. There is a monastery in the mountains that erased its own scriptures. There is a city underneath a city where every faith burned itself into frescoes no one can read. There is a temple above the clouds, and one below the ice. And you keep them all? I asked. I visit, he said. I listen. I speak when someone comes with the right kind of questions. Call it keeping, if you like. Time does not need a custodian, but humans often do. He rose and held out a hand. You are not done yet. The path is long. As I took his hand and let him lead me back through the dripping cave, the sense of walking not just through space, but through a thickening weave of years settled around me like a cloak. The silent cathedrals of time were not just ruins. They were mirrors in which my own era, my own restless, distracted age, might someday be reflected as a faint, shimmering image. Somewhere in an unimaginable future, a stranger might press their hand to a cracked screen or fragment of printed page and feel a faint echo of our questions. The thought was both humbling and strangely comforting. When we emerged from the cave into the blind white glare of day, the river roared past as if it had never paused. The guide shaded her eyes, looked at me and nodded once, as if something had been decided. You are not the first to come, the keeper said, and you will not be the last. Time is generous with its invitations, even if most people decline without knowing they were asked. How many more are there? I asked. His smile held both mischief and sorrow. Enough. We boarded the boat. The current took us, carrying us back towards settlements and roads and the thin skein of Wi-Fi that stitched the modern world together. But I felt as though a deeper current had caught me, one that flowed not just from upriver to downriver, but from before to after, from forgotten to not yet known. The silent cathedrals were waiting, their stones patient, their drowned steps steady under the weight of water. Somewhere in mountain air or city dust, other forgotten faiths had left their houses standing, not to demand worship, but to offer remembrance. I did not yet know their names, but time and the keeper would show me. And so, the journey went on. The mountains greeted me with thin air, and a silence that felt sharper than any I had known in desert or jungle. On the map, the region was a tangle of contour lines and sparse place names, a high range straddling the border between languages, between climates, between histories. Travelers came here to climb, to trek, to stand on ridges and take photographs of themselves against distant peaks. Very few came for the monastery that lay tucked in a side valley, several days' journey from the nearest marked trail. By then, I had learned that the world's forgotten sanctuaries seldom appeared where brochures suggested. The path up to the monastery wound through forests of stunted pines and over scree slopes, where every step sent small avalanches of stones clattering into the ravine below. My guide this time was a wiry young man with a calm smile and a habit of humming tunelessly under his breath. He had never heard of the place I described, but when I showed him my hand-drawn map, a composite of hints from old journals, expedition reports, and a half-deciphered inscription from the museum cellar, his eyes widened. My grandfather spoke of such a place, he said. The monastery that turned its back on the world. He said the monks there erased their own words. I thought it only a story to frighten children into finishing their lessons. We camped in the last scraps of tree line, where the wind combed the grass in restless waves. Stars came out in brittle, dazzling profusion. It was too cold for many insects, and the quiet was so complete that the crackle of the campfire sounded like distant thunder. I lay awake long after my guide's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of sleep. Above me, the Milky Way arched like a pale scar across the sky. I thought of the desert temples' vanished constellations, of the river's remembered rituals, and wondered what kind of wound or healing had taken place in the monastery we were approaching. "You are closer than you think," said a voice from the darkness. I turned my head. The keeper sat at the edge of the firelight, hat in his hands, boots dusted with a thin sheen of frost. The light from the embers painted hollows under his cheekbones, and his eyes reflected the flames in pinpoints of gold. "You never seem to be out of breath," I said, "or hungry, or tired." "I get what I need in other places," he said, "not in ways you would find comforting." He tilted his head back to regard the stars. "This is a good sky. It belongs to more than one faith." "What do you mean?" "Think of all the pilgrims who have walked under it," he said. "Followers of mountain gods and sun gods, hermits and poets, saints and skeptics, men and women who climbed these paths with hearts full of prayers, and others who simply came seeking a quiet hour away from the noise below. They all looked up. They all saw these stars. Whatever names they gave that experience, the light itself was common currency." "And the monastery?" I asked. "What did they see?" "For a long time, too long perhaps, they saw only their own reflections," he said. "Come, sleep if you can. Tomorrow you will see what's left." Morning was a slow unfurling of light over peaks and ridges. We packed our tent with numb fingers and set out along a narrow path that clung to the mountainside like a thought that would not fully form. The air grew thinner with each step, and my breath came in short, painful pulls. Then the trail rounded a shoulder of rock, and the monastery revealed itself. It clung to the cliff face as if grown from it, a cluster of stone buildings with sloping roofs, their wooden beams silvered with age. A long stairway, partly carved into the rock and partly constructed from rough-hewn blocks, led up to a heavy wooden gate. Colourful prayer flags once stretched from the roofs to poles sunk into the cliff, but time and weather had shredded them into faint, faded streamers. As we approached, my guide slowed, then stopped altogether. "I will not go further," he said, eyes fixed on the gate. "This place has a feeling. I do not like it." "You believe the stories your grandfather told, then?" I asked. "I believe my bones," he said simply. "They say no. I will wait here. If you do not return by sunset, I will go down and speak your name at the village shrine." "Is that a blessing?" I asked, attempting a smile. "It is whatever you need it to be," he replied gravely. I left him there and climbed the steps alone. Each one felt slightly different in height, as if they had been carved by many hands over many years, each mason making subtle adjustments based on his own stride. The air smelled of stone dust and old incense. The gate stood ajar. There was no lock, no chain, no sign forbidding entry, only an absence, as if the building itself had drawn in a breath and never let it go. I stepped inside. The courtyard was larger than I'd expected, framed by cloistered walkways and low buildings. Empty flagpoles rattled softly in the wind. A well sat at its center, its stone lip worn smooth beyond the far wall. The nightens reared up, staggering in their indifference. "This was not always an abandoned place," the keeper said, peering beside the well, as if he had stepped out of my shadow. His breath did not smoke in the cold air. Mine did. "I gathered that much," I said. "They were devout, you know," he went on. "Devout in the way only those convinced of their own smallness can be. Their faith taught that words were traps, but to name the divine was to limit it. And so they praised their god in paradoxes and silence, in gestures and patterns. For centuries, this worked very well. We walked along the cloister. The walls were painted with murals, but at first glance they seemed nothing more than foggy smears of grey, brown, and faded blue. Figures emerged only when I looked closely. Kneeling monks, mountain spirits, stylized flames. All of them had been partially obscured by later brushstrokes of white, as if someone had tried to erase the images without quite succeeding. What happened? I asked. The same thing that happens to any system devoted to purity, the keeper said quietly. They turned inward. They began to fear contamination, not from enemies or outsiders, but from their own thoughts. Each time someone tried to articulate a teaching, another would point out the limitation in those words. Each attempt to praise their god was discovered to be inadequate, insulting even once examined. They became obsessed with erasing their own mistakes. He gestured toward the murals. These are not the work of iconoclasts from outside. This is the work of the monks themselves. They painted their vision of heaven, then repented for having dared to depict it, and covered it in white. They wrote hymns, then burned them for having presumed to describe the indescribable. We entered a long hall whose walls were lined with shelves. At least they had once been. Now most of the shelves were empty, their wood carved with shallow repetitive grooves, where scrolls or books had once rested. A few scraps of parchment lay scattered on the floor, their ink washed into illegibility by water or time. Eventually, the keeper said, they ceased creating and devoted themselves entirely to uncreating. They studied their own archives only to hunt for error. When they found what they deemed a dangerous phrase, they scraped it off the page and carefully recorded the act of scraping in another volume, which they would later also condemn as presumptuous and destroy. They saw this as a kind of holy pruning. They believed that if they removed every impure thought, what remained would be pure awareness. What remained? I asked, already knowing the answer. He spread his hands toward the empty shelves. This. They succeeded more completely than they intended. Their books are gone, their paintings obscured, their music forgotten. The last generation left behind detailed instructions for erasing even their own names. And yet the monastery stands, I said. Yes. He looked at me with something like pride. For all their efforts to disentangle themselves from history, they left a very clear imprint on time. Their devotion to erasure became, ironically, the most indelible part of their legacy. That is why this place is one of the cathedrals. I ran my fingers over the nearest shelf. The grooves in the wood felt oddly familiar, like an echo of the desert temple's lines and the river shrine's arches. Do they haunt it? I asked. The monks? Not in the way you mean. He led me to the far end of the hall, where a single book remained on a pedestal, wrapped in rotting cloth. Their ghosts are not personalities, but practices watch. He did not touch the book. Instead, he blew gently across its surface. Dust rose like smoke, swirling in the slanting light from a high window. For a moment, the particles hung in the air in patterns. Letters, words, sentences in a script I did not recognize. They seemed to form, hesitate, and then, as if ashamed of their own daring, disperse. Even now, the keeper murmured, the habit of erasure persists. This building has a reflex against being pinned down. Is there anything left of what they believed? I asked. Any trace of their god, their teachings? He thought for a long moment. They believed that the divine was what remained when you let go of every image, every idea, every story, he said at last. In that sense, their God is everywhere there is silence, here especially. We stood and listened. The silence was not empty. It was dense with things unsaid, with words that had once hung in the air and been carefully disassembled. It felt like standing in a library after a great fire, the phantom of knowledge lingering like heat on the walls. In that silence, I heard, faintly, the murmuring of my own age, the constant production of commentary, the endless stream of opinions, the fear of missing a moment, a trend, a phrase. For a heartbeat, I felt a fierce kinship with those monks, their longing to carve away the unnecessary to reveal something essential beneath. But I also saw their mistake. In their zeal to purify, they had cut themselves away not only from error, but from relationship. Their faith had become a mirror turned on itself until it reflected nothing at all. That is why it is valuable as a cathedral, the keeper said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Not because they were right or wrong, but because they show one way a human longing can twist when taken to its extreme. Time remembers such experiments. We left the hall and climbed a narrow stair to the rooftop. From there, the view was staggering. Mountains rising in serried ranks, valleys dropping away into blue haze, the sky an immense translucent bowl overhead. Wind tugged at my clothes and slipped cold fingers into my hair. Once, they came up here to watch the dawn, the keeper said. They believed that if they could greet the first light without a single word arising in their minds, they would be free of all illusions. Did anyone succeed? I asked. He smiled. You tell me. We stood together as a cloud parted, and a shaft of sunlight slid across a distant peak, igniting it in gold. For a moment, all the stories fell away. Desert temples and drowned shrines, erased scriptures and coming ruins. There was only light on rock, and the thin, sweet sting of air in my lungs. No words came, or rather many did, but they felt redundant. The experience was already complete. After a long time, the keeper spoke again. You see, even here, in the ruins of their excess, there is something to learn. Not as a dogma, but as a perspective. These places remember not only their builders' mistakes, but their glimpses of understanding. Is that why you call them cathedrals? I asked. I rarely call them anything, he said. You were the one who named them that, in your notes after the desert temple. Silent cathedrals of time. I liked the phrase. I stared at him. You read my notes? He shrugged. You leave them in places easy to find, on screens, in notebooks, in the backs of your thoughts. Time has a way of catching such things. His expression softened. Names matter. They shape how you attend to the world. You could have called these ruins dead religions or failed cults. You chose cathedrals of time. That tells me something about what you're ready to hear. And what is that? I asked. That you're beginning to see faith not as a set of answers, but as an ongoing conversation with what exceeds you, he said. And that you're ready to see how the conversation continues even after the words have been forgotten. We descended from the roof. As we left the monastery, I felt the silence stretch behind us, like a held breath finally released. My guide was waiting where I had left him, sitting on a rock and tossing small stones into the ravine. When he saw me, relief softened his features. "You went very still," he said. "Even from here, I could feel it." "Did you ever think of becoming a monk?" I asked impulsively. He laughed. "No. I like food and songs too much. My grandfather says a faith that forgets to dance is sick." We began the long journey back to the world of roads and networks. The mountains slowly receded behind us, their white peaks bright against the sky. Days folded into weeks. My life became a series of thresholds. Airport gates, station platforms, border crossings. Between each, a cathedral. There was the underground city, discovered beneath a modern metropolis when workers digging a new subway tunnel broke through into a frescoed chamber. Officially, it was sealed off for preservation. Unofficially, the keeper and I slipped in one damp evening, our flashlights catching gleams of gold and pigment on walls that told stories in a dozen styles. Here, a serpent god devouring its tail circled a Christian saint. There, a wheel of reincarnation turned beneath a crescent moon. Generations of conquerors had painted over each other's symbols, only for the next to do the same, until the walls were a palimpsest of devotion and triumph, fear and hope. No single faith remained intact. The cathedral there was not to a god, but to the human urge to inscribe meaning on stone. There was the cavern beneath a glacier, reachable only by crawling through a tunnel of blue ice. The air inside was so cold it burned. At its heart lay a ring of standing stones, slick with ancient frost, their arrangement calculated to catch the pale light filtering through the ice above. People who had built it were long gone, their culture obliterated by shifting climate and migrating beasts. But on certain days of the year, the keeper told me, the light still aligned perfectly, pouring down in a column that turned the frozen air into liquid gold. "A cathedral," he said to Patience. There was a small island in a great lake, occupied now only by birds. Once, a temple there had housed a statue of a god of echoes and returns. Now, only the pedestal remained, its surface colonized by moss. When the wind blew just right between the rocks, the sound of the waves striking the shore resolved into something like chanting, a low, repetitive murmur that seemed to answer itself. Each place left an imprint on me, a texture, a mood, a question. Gradually, my sense of time shifted. The present felt less like a point on a line and more like a room in a vast building, connected by doorways to other rooms, some bright, some dark, some piled with forgotten furniture, others bare and echoing. One evening, as we sat on a hill overlooking a city whose lights spread out like spilled jewels, I asked the keeper, "Do the cathedrals ever end? Is there a last one?" "There is a last one for you," he said. "Time is long, your life is not. At some point, your body will say, 'Enough.'" "And for you?" I ventured. "Do they end for you?" He smiled in a way that made him look for a heartbeat, very tired. "I am not bound to time the way you are," he said. "But that does not mean I am free of it. I am. An arrangement it has tried on. One of the ways it has chosen to speak to itself. When I am no longer needed, I will unravel. Something else will take my place." "That sounds lonely," I said. "Loneliness is just a name for a certain arrangement of attention," he replied. When you're listening deeply, you're never truly alone. The last cathedral he showed me did not yet exist, or rather, it existed in more than one sense, folded into a knot of time I could only glimpse from the corner of my mind's eye. We met in a field on the outskirts of a sprawling city, under a sky lit not by stars, but by a dull orange haze. The air smelled of exhaust and distant rain. Construction cranes stood like skeletal fingers against the horizon. There, the keeper said, pointing toward a cluster of unfinished towers. Look. I looked. At first, I saw only the obvious: concrete pillars, steel girders, glass panels reflecting the murky sky. Then, as I let my gaze soften, other images began to seep through. A soaring hall of light and shadow, its walls lined not with stone carvings, but with screens, 1,000 small rectangles, each displaying a different pattern of color and motion. People moved through the hall, their faces lit from below by the pale glow of devices in their hands. Some knelt, not before statues, but before abstract diagrams, immersive projections of data streams and orbits. Others sat in silence, eyes closed, listening to a hum that seemed to rise from the very bones of the building. "This is a temple?" I asked, startled. "In one branch of possibility," the keeper said, "a sanctuary built for a faith that has not yet fully named itself. A faith in human continuity, perhaps, or in consciousness as a pattern that can be stored and reassembled. They will call it many things. Some will come here believing they can pray themselves into servers. Others will come simply because it is quiet and beautiful." In the vision, I saw a child standing at the center of the hall, looking up at a ceiling that displayed a simulation of the universe. Galaxies wheeling in slow, stately arcs around her, murmured debates about ethics and personhood, identity and replication, rose and fell like incense. "What happens to it?" I asked. "What happens to all temples?" the keeper said. "It flourishes, it divides, is fought over, defended, abandoned. Its screens go dark when the power grid fails. Its servers decay. Moisture seeps into its walls. Centuries later, someone stands where you're standing now, staring at a fragment of its architecture protruding from a hillside, and wonders what those people believed." My chest tightened. "Then why show it to me?" "Because you live nearer to this possibility than to those we have seen," he said gently. "Because your choices, collective, not individual, will help determine whether this future faith is born gentle or cruel, inclusive or exclusive, attuned to the rest of the world, or sealed in its own hall of mirrors." "And the cathedral," I whispered, "will it be one too?" "Oh, yes." His eyes shone with a sober kind of joy. "Time will remember it, as it remembers all the places where humans try to speak with what they did not fully understand. It will be one of the silent cathedrals someday, just as your era's screens and towers will be. I am showing you so that, when you walk through your own temples, be they churches or offices, data centers or shopping malls, you will feel the weight of that continuity." The vision faded. The half-built towers stood in the orange glow, skeletal and ordinary. I looked at the keeper. "So, what am I meant to do with all this?" I asked. "I'm just one person. I've seen deserts and rivers, ice and stone, future screens and past walls. I've listened, like you said. But what now?" "Now," he said, "you remember. When you feel tempted to declare that your own time is uniquely enlightened or uniquely doomed, you remember these cathedrals. When you hear people speak with contempt of those who believe differently, you recall the care with which they carved stone, the patience with which they aligned their devotions to stars or rivers or empty air. When you yourself feel the tug toward erasing what you once held dear, you remember the monastery and ask whether you are pruning or cutting your own roots. "That doesn't sound like much," I said. "It is not spectacular," he agreed, "but it is how time stays honest with itself. It is also how you stay human in the face of your own impermanence." We walked in silence for a while, our footsteps crunching on gravel. The city's noise grew as we approached, a wash of engines and sirens, voices and vibrations. Somewhere a billboard flickered, its advertisement briefly glitching into a pattern of static that looked for an instant like a broken circle with a triangle at its heart. I stopped. "That symbol," I said. "I've seen it in every place we visited. Desert temple, river shrine, glacier cave, underground city. What is it?" He followed my gaze, then smiled. An old sigil, one of time's little jokes, perhaps, or one of the ways humans across ages and cultures have tried to draw the feeling of being between things. The circle broken, the point suspended in the center. "Between what?" I asked. "Between before and after," he said. "Between knowing and not knowing. Between worship and forgetting. The cathedrals all stand in such in-between places. So do you." "You too," I said. He inclined his head. "So do I." We reached a busy intersection. Pedestrians surged around us, each carrying a world of private rituals and unspoken beliefs. No one seemed to notice the thin, slightly out-of-place man at my side, or the way the light around him did not quite behave like the light around anyone else. "This is where we part, for now," he said. "Will I see you again?" I asked. He considered. "In a way, you see me whenever you stand in an old doorway and feel the weight of years, whenever you touch a relic and sense that you're not the first to love or fear it, whether I am there as a person, in this shape." He shrugged. "Time will decide." I wanted to ask more about his origins, his nature, the mechanics of his appearances, but I had visited enough cathedrals by then to recognize that some doors should remain half open. Their power lay not in neat explanations, but in the spaces they left for wonder. Instead, I said, "Thank you for guiding me." "It is what I am arranged to do," he replied. Then softer, "And it has been pleasant. Not everyone who comes to these places listens as you have. Not everyone asks questions without demanding answers that fit in their pockets." He stepped back. The crowd flowed between us, a river of bodies. For an instant, his hat rose above the sea of heads like a small, dark boat. Then it was gone. I stood there in the heart of a living city, listening. Under the honk of horns and the buzz of electricity, I heard other sounds, the distant ring of a chisel on stone, the slap of river water against steps, the rasp of a brush scraping away pigment, the low chant of voices rising in a room lit by screens and stars. All of it was time, speaking in different registers. All of it was prayer, in a sense. Even the atheist's careful experiment, the skeptic's diligent question, the child's repetition of a rhyme she did not yet understand. Later, I would return to my work, framing what I had seen in words that could be printed, archived, argued over. Some readers would call it myth, others metaphor, others perhaps hallucination. That was all right. The cathedrals did not need belief. They had stone and water, ice and data, wind and light. They had the long, slow attention of time itself. But when I sat down to write, I began with a simple sentence, one that had grown in me over the miles and years. There are buildings that remember us better than we remember ourselves. From there, the stories unfolded, of deserts and rivers, monasteries and glaciers, underground cities and future halls. I wrote them not as instructions, but as invitations, not to worship, but to listen. Somewhere, in a temple whose roof had fallen centuries before I was born, dust stirred. In a drowned stairwell, a ripple passed through water older than any of my words. In a mountain hall of empty shells, the air seemed, for a moment, to hold its breath. And in the great cathedral without walls, the slow, turning architecture of time itself, a note sounded, very small, but very clear, and went on ringing long after my pen lifted from the page.